Carthage was everything Rome wanted to be. Rich, ancient, and powerful. A Phoenician city founded on the northern coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia, centuries before Rome had managed to build a single decent wall. Where Rome had spent its early centuries clawing territory from its neighbors hill by hill, Carthage had built a maritime empire that stretched across the entire western Mediterranean: Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the trade routes that connected them all. Carthage didn't conquer land the way Rome did. It controlled the sea, and whoever controlled the sea controlled everything that moved across it. For a long time, Rome and Carthage had coexisted peacefully. They had even signed treaties multiple times, acknowledging each other's spheres of influence. Rome stayed on land, Carthage stayed on water. There was enough Mediterranean for both of them. Then Sicily got complicated. In 264 BC, a dispute between two Sicilian cities, the kind of minor local conflict that flares up and dies down 100 times a century, somehow pulled both Rome and Carthage in on opposite sides. Nobody planned a world war. Nobody sat down and decided that this was the moment to fight for dominance of the Western Mediterranean. It just escalated the way these things do, until two of the most powerful states in the ancient world found themselves at war over an island neither of them had originally intended to own. This was the First Punic War. It lasted 23 years. Rome had a problem from the beginning. Carthage was a naval power. Rome had almost no navy. The Romans had spent 2 centuries perfecting land warfare and had given almost no thought to what happened when the enemy didn't want to fight on land. Carthage could project force anywhere along any coastline. Rome could not follow. So Rome did what Rome always did when it encountered a problem it didn't know how to solve. It looked at how other people solved it, copied the best parts, and then improved on them. According to the Roman historian Polybius, the Romans found a wrecked Carthaginian warship washed up on the Italian coast and used it as a template. Within 60 days, an almost unbelievable timeline, they had built a fleet of 120 warships. Then they trained crews to row them, which took somewhat longer, but Rome understood that it couldn't simply match Carthage at naval warfare. Carthaginian sailors had centuries of experience. Roman sailors had weeks. Fighting a conventional naval battle meant losing a conventional naval battle. So Rome invented the corvus. It was a boarding bridge, a long spiked plank mounted on a rotating pole at the prow of each Roman warship. When 2 ships came close enough, the Romans dropped the corvus onto the enemy deck, where the spike drove in and locked the ships together. And then Roman soldiers, real soldiers, trained soldiers, the best infantry in the known world, poured across the bridge and turned a naval battle into a land battle fought on water. It worked magnificently. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the Romans destroyed a Carthaginian fleet that should have annihilated them. They did it again at the Battle of Ecnomus, which may have been the largest naval battle in ancient history, with perhaps 300,000 men involved across both fleets. Rome was winning. And then the sea itself intervened. Storms. The Mediterranean in winter is not the placid blue expanse of tourist postcards. It is violent, unpredictable, and indifferent to the ambitions of republics. Roman fleets, overloaded, poorly designed for open water, crewed by men who had been sailors for months rather than lifetimes, were destroyed not by Carthage, but by weather. In 255 BC, a storm off the coast of Sicily sank perhaps 700 Roman ships and killed around 100,000 men. It was one of the greatest maritime disasters in human history. Rome built more ships, lost more ships to storms, built more again. The stubbornness was almost incomprehensible. Any other state would have made peace. Rome kept building. The war ended in 241 BC with a Roman naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Rome's fleet rebuilt yet again, catching a Carthaginian fleet that was undermanned and overloaded with supplies. Carthage sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. Rome collected a massive indemnity, and Carthage, humiliated and financially broken, withdrew. It was not over. Everyone knew it was not over. Carthage spent the next 2 decades rebuilding. Not in Africa, but in Spain. A brilliant Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca carved out a new empire in the Iberian Peninsula, rich in silver mines and manpower. When he died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the project. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army in Spain chose their own commander by acclamation. His name was Hannibal Barca. He was 26 years old, and he had hated Rome since childhood. His father, according to legend, had made him swear an oath of eternal enmity against it when he was 9 years old and begged to come along on campaign. Hannibal was not like other generals. He was not interested in fighting Rome the way Rome expected to be fought. He was not going to sail an army across the Mediterranean and attack from the south, where Rome had its defenses prepared. He was not going to wait for Rome to come to him. He was going to walk to Rome, through Spain, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, across the Alps, in winter, with 100,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants. When he proposed this plan, presumably his officers looked at him in silence for a long moment. He did it anyway. The crossing of the Alps in 218 BC remains one of the most audacious military movements in human history. The passes were not the gentle tourist routes of today. They were narrow, ice-covered, controlled by hostile mountain tribes who rolled boulders down onto the army from above. Men fell, horses fell, elephants, remarkably sure-footed, but not designed for alpine conditions, fell. Disease, cold, and ambush killed tens of thousands before Hannibal's army descended into the Po Valley on the other side. He had started with around 100,000 men. He arrived in Italy with perhaps half that number. It didn't matter. What followed was the most terrifying military campaign Rome had ever faced. Hannibal moved through northern Italy like a force of nature, and the Roman legions came out to stop him one after another, and one after another they were destroyed. At the Trebia River in 218 BC, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a freezing river crossing at dawn, then hit them from three sides simultaneously. Annihilation. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he ambushed an entire Roman army on a narrow lakeside path, with soldiers hidden in the fog on the hills above. 15,000 Romans died in less than 3 hours, including the consul commanding them. The men at the back of the column, not yet under attack, were pushed forward by the pressure from behind into the killing zone. Some fled into the lake and drowned in their armor. It was a slaughter of almost incomprehensible efficiency. But these were opening acts, warm-ups, practice for what came next. Cannae? 216 BC. Rome had raised the largest army in its history, somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, depending on the source. They marched to meet Hannibal on a flat plain near the town of Cannae in southern Italy. The flat ground was deliberate. No tricks possible on flat ground. No ambushes, just two armies facing each other, and Rome had more men, and Rome would win. Hannibal placed his weakest troops in the center of his line and his best troops on the wings. The Romans advanced. The center gave way deliberately, slowly, drawing the Romans forward. The Roman formation compressed as they pushed into the retreating center, packing tighter and tighter, losing the space they needed to swing their swords. And then the wings closed, the double envelopment, the encirclement. An army of perhaps 50,000 Romans surrounded on all sides, packed so tightly that men in the middle couldn't raise their arms. The killing took hours. When it was over, between 50 and 70,000 Romans were dead. The Carthaginians walked the field stripping rings from the fingers of Roman knights, and the rings were so numerous that ancient sources describe them being measured by the bushel. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, possibly the worst defeat any army suffered in a single day in the ancient world. And Rome kept fighting. This is the part that defies understanding. After Cannae, Hannibal sent an envoy to Rome offering peace terms. The Senate refused to receive him. They refused to ransom the prisoners Hannibal had taken. They passed laws forbidding mourning in public, not because they weren't devastated, but because they would not let Hannibal see it. A dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus proposed a new strategy. Don't fight Hannibal directly. He's too good. Shadow his army. Cut off his foragers. Attack his supply lines. Wear him down. Wait him out. The Romans called him Cunctator, the delayer, and they meant it as an insult. But his strategy was working. Hannibal marched through Italy for 15 years. He won every battle he fought. He devastated the countryside. He tried to peel away Rome's Italian allies, and some of them did defect. Most crucially, Capua, the second largest city in Italy. But most of Rome's allies held. The Romans had spent 2 centuries building a network of relationships, obligations, and shared interests with the peoples of Italy, and that network proved stronger than Hannibal's victories. Without a siege train, Hannibal couldn't take Rome itself. Without reinforcements from Carthage, which the Carthaginian Senate, in a staggering failure of strategic nerve, largely failed to provide, he couldn't force a decisive conclusion. He was winning every battle and losing the war. Rome, meanwhile, was fighting everywhere. In Spain, the Scipio family was grinding down Carthaginian power province by province. In Sicily, Roman forces retook Syracuse after a brutal siege. In Greece, Rome fought Macedon, which had allied itself with Hannibal after Cannae. The end came not in Italy, but in Africa. A young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had both been killed fighting Carthage in Spain, and who had himself fought at Cannae as a young officer, proposed the unthinkable. Take the war to Africa, threaten Carthage itself, force Hannibal to come home. The Senate was skeptical. Scipio got his army anyway. He landed in Africa in 204 BC. He allied with a Numidian king named Massinissa and his extraordinary cavalry. He won battle after battle. Carthage, panicking, recalled Hannibal from Italy. Hannibal had been in Italy for 15 years. He had never been defeated. He came home to fight the man who had studied him, learned from him, and was now going to use his own tactics against him. They met at Zama in 202 BC. Hannibal placed his war elephants at the front, a terrifying opening move that had broken lesser armies. Scipio had prepared for it. He arranged his legions with wide gaps between the maniples and trained his men to shout and blow trumpets when the elephants charged. The animals panicked, turned, and trampled Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings. Massinissa's Numidian horsemen swept around and hit the Carthaginian rear. The encirclement. Cannae in reverse. Hannibal, who had invented the double envelopment, now experienced it. Carthage surrendered. The Second Punic War was over. Rome imposed crushing terms. The entire Spanish Empire surrendered. The fleet reduced to 10 ships, an indemnity so large it would take 50 years to pay off. Carthage was allowed to exist, but as a client state, permanently diminished, permanently watched. Hannibal himself went into exile rather than be handed over to Rome. He spent years wandering the courts of Eastern kings, always trying to organize one more coalition against Rome, always finding that nobody was quite willing to take the risk. Eventually, cornered in a small town in Bithynia, with Roman agents closing in, he swallowed poison he had kept hidden in a ring. He was 64 years old. His last recorded words, according to tradition, were, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too much to wait for the death of an old man." Carthage itself lasted another 50 years. But a faction in the Roman Senate, led by the aging Cato the Elder, had decided that 50 years was 50 years too many. Cato ended every speech he gave, on any topic, in any context, with the same 5 words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually, Rome agreed. The Third Punic War lasted 3 years. It was not really a war. It was a siege, and then a demolition. The city of Carthage was taken house by house, street by street, in brutal urban combat that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The survivors, perhaps 50,000, were sold into slavery. The buildings were torn down. The site was cursed. The story that Rome salted the earth so nothing would grow there is almost certainly a later invention. But the impulse behind the myth is true enough. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage. It erased it. It removed it from the world so completely that for centuries the location of the city was uncertain. Carthago delenda est. It was.